The legend of St Tarcisius is a story that I grew up hearing, and I think a lot of people who grew up trad like I did probably grew up hearing the same story. It was a very popular one to tell to kids, at least in my neck of the woods. When I was still Catholic, I never thought it was weird how stressed stories of child martyrs were to children. I never thought about the importance that was placed on children being willing to die for the Catholic Church and all that. And upon reflection, I probably do feel kind of different about that now, to say the least. But in this video, I will be examining the historicity of the story of St. Tarcisius, and then I'll be talking a little bit about what it's like to be a kid, like 7 years old, and wishing to be a martyr, which is something that I did. Let's jump into it. If you're not familiar with the story of St. Tarcisius, I would recommend that you listen to the entire YouTube video that I'm about to play. It's only 2 minutes long, but that story is almost, not exactly, but almost how I would hear the story growing up, kind of told in this kind of almost like fable kind of way. We'll get there, but just to start, I'm going to tell you the story in my own words, and I'm going to try to do it as accurately to the story that I would have, heard growing up. So St. Tarcisius was an altar boy, a young man, probably, between the ages of 10 and 14 or something like that. It was common practice in the ancient Roman Empire to bring the Eucharist to the sick or the imprisoned or just to anybody who couldn't make it to Mass on Sunday. And of course, at this time, being Christian was illegal, so it was a fugitive. So on one particular Sunday, a priest asked the young altar boy Tarcisius to bring the Eucharist to some prisoners. Along the way, Tarcisius was stopped by a group of his friends who were not Christian, and those friends said, "Hey, Tarcisius, come play with us." Tarcisius said, I can't, I'm on an important errand, I really got to get going. And his friends were like, come on, what errand is so important that you can't play with us? And Tarcisius was insisting that he really had to run. And then his friends were getting suspicious. Hey, what are you holding in that cloth close to your chest? Like, what's the deal there? And when Tarcisius wouldn't tell them what it was, Tarcisius's friends did what all friends do. They promptly beat him to death. As Tarcisius was dying, a Roman guard found him and picked him up. This guard was secretly a Christian, and so he brought Tarcisius back to the catacombs where the priest would say Mass and stuff like that. And Tarcisius died along the way, but the priest found that the Eucharist was entirely unharmed. Tarcisius had died successfully defending the Eucharist. That's the long and short of the story as I would have heard it growing up, and I read it in Catholic children's books and stuff like that. But I would hear these specific things, specific quotes that St. Tarcisius said, or even the priest said to St. Tarcisius. I am now going to play the video that I was talking about earlier. This is from a video called St. Tarcisius, posted by Pope's Worldwide Prayer Network USA. It has 51,000 views, so it's pretty well viewed. And I would just like to play 10 seconds of this video for you so that you understand the kind of, fable way that the story is told, but also the way that we would hear exact quotes.
One day when the priest asked who was going to take it, Tarcisius said, "Send me." To the priest's protests, who thought him too young, he said, "My youth will be my best defense."
So you hear St. Tarcisius saying something like, "Send me," when the priest asked who will take it, the Eucharist. And he says, "My youth will be my best defense." I'll be able to kind of, skirt around the guards, and the guards won't really be paying attention to me because I'm a kid or whatever. I wanted to play that clip to you specifically because I wanted you to hear the story with specific quotations added in, as if we do have the words that Tarcisius actually spoke. I have learned enough about history, though, at this point, that whenever I hear specific details, like records of a conversation, in a story that supposedly comes from the 2nd century, my skeptical hairs stand on end. Obviously, I wasn't skeptical as a kid, but I am now. So I wanted to do a little bit of digging. As it turns out, our earliest source of St. Tarcisius comes from one poem, which was found engraved in a catacomb. Here it is. Here's the Latin, And here's the English translation. Let's read the English translation together. You who read, whoever you are, recognize the equal merit of the two to whom Damascus the bishop has dedicated this inscription after their rewards. So, dear reader, recognize the equal merit of these two people who Pope Damascus, the Bishop of Rome, has dedicated this inscription to. The Jewish people stoned Stephen when he was instructing them on a better course. He who carried off the trophy from the enemy, the faithful deacon, first laid hold of martyrdom. So the second line here is like, hey, St. Stephen, first martyr, the OG, he's awesome. Then here's the second half of the poem. When a raving gang was pressing holy Tarsicius to reveal to the uninitiated the sacraments of Christ that he was carrying, he wished rather to release his spirit, struck down, than to betray the heavenly limbs to mad dogs. So notice that the first half of that poem is dedicated to St. Stephen, and then the second half is dedicated to St. Tarcisius. The only lines dedicated to St. Tarcisius is right here. This really only forms a single sentence. When a raving gang was pressing holy Tarsicius to reveal to the uninitiated the sacraments of Christ that he was carrying, he wished rather to release his spirit struck down than to betray the heavenly limbs to mad dogs. That's it. That's all that we have about Tarsicius. We know that this was dedicated by Pope Damascus. He reigned from 366 to 384, roughly. So it's likely that this was commissioned by Pope Damascus sometime in that range. Like, we can call it the 370s or so. But notice that this single sentence, it doesn't include any reference to a year. So how do we know? I mentioned earlier that Tarsicius is from the 2nd century. How do we know that? It's just context clues, because Pope Damascus actually commissioned a whole bunch of other similar poems about the early martyrs, who from 100 to 150 years earlier. So we don't know when Tarsicius would have lived and died, but historians have said somewhere in that 3rd century. Notably, there is no mention of Tarsicius's age. If anything, you might assume that Tarsicius and Stephen were around the same age, but the poem doesn't actually say that. It compares the two. It says that the two are equal in the equal merit of the two, but equal merit doesn't necessarily mean the same age, but rather there's just no age at all listed for Tarsicius in this single sentence that we get. If anything, maybe you assume that he was at least a deacon like St. Stephen was. But again, I don't think we can confirm that either. All we have is this single sentence. So where do all of these extra details about the life of St. Tarcisius come from? Where do his age, the details about the raving gang actually being his friends, those direct quotes from St. Tarcisius and the priest who sent him on his mission, where does all of this come from? Well, the Catholic Encyclopedia admits that the only positive information concerning this Roman martyr is found in the poem composed in his honor by Pope Damascus. In these lines, Damascus compares Tarsicius to the proto-martyr Stephen. Just as the latter was stoned to death, so Tarsicius, carrying the Blessed Sacrament, was attacked by a heathen rabble, and he suffered death rather than surrender the sacred body of Christ to the raging dogs. The tradition so positively asserted by Damascus is undoubtedly historical. I like how the encyclopedia just throws that out there. But then the encyclopedia does note that nothing definite is known concerning the personality of this martyr of the Eucharist. He may have been a deacon, as Damascus compares him to Stephen. An addition to the 6th century legend of the martyrdom of Pope St. Stephen makes Tarsicius, for some unknown reason, an acolyte. So the Catholic Encyclopedia doesn't straight up say it, but for some unknown reason sounds almost snarky to me and leads me to believe that the Catholic Encyclopedia thinks that St. Tarcisius was probably older than the story that I presented to you at the beginning and the story that we heard in that YouTube video. An acolyte is an altar boy. An acolyte would be significantly younger than a deacon. But in the 6th century, somebody writes that Tarsicius was an acolyte, a type of altar boy, and then boom, from that time onward, the tradition is that Tarcisius was a young boy. But the 6th century would be, 300 plus years after the life of St. Tarcisius. I don't think that's going to be a very reliable tradition to base somebody's age off of. I mean, the poem that we have is 100 years after he would have lived and died. So I feel like the single line poem probably isn't very much to go off of either, but something from the 6th century, that's even worse. But what about those direct quotes? Well, I'm going to play that video, and then I'm going to compare it to something else. I'm going to compare the quotes from this YouTube video to some text that I will have up on the screen.
Was very dangerous. One day when the priest asked who was going to take it, Tarcisius said, "Send me." To the priest's protests, who thought him too young, he said, "My youth will be my best defense."
Okay. "My youth will be my best defense. Thou art too young, my child," said the kind priest, filled with admiration of the picture before him. "My youth, Holy Father, will be my best protection. Oh, do not refuse me this great honor." The tears stood in the boy's eyes, and his cheeks glowed with a modest emotion as he spoke these words. He stretched forth his hands eagerly. Keep reading. Okay. Let's keep listening here.
The priest then said to Tarcisius, "Remember that a heavenly treasure is entrusted to your weak care. Avoid busy streets, and do not forget that holy things must not be thrown to the dogs, nor gems to swine."
Remember, Tarcisius, what a treasure is entrusted to thy feeble care. Avoid public places as thou goest along, and remember that holy things must not be delivered to dogs, nor pearls be cast before swine.
Will you safeguard the sacred mysteries with fidelity and security? I will rather die than relinquish them.
Thou wilt keep safely God's sacred gifts? I will die rather than betray them, answered the holy youth. I mean, that's pretty close to being word for word, is it not? Well, what is this text that I'm quoting from? Surely it's some kind of record from, ancient Roman times from the 3rd century or whatever, right? Well, this is a novel. It's called Fabiola, or The Church of the Catacombs, and it's written by a certain Cardinal Wiseman, Cardinal Nicholas Patrick Wiseman. This novel was first published in 1854. And that's right. It's a novel. It's about a made-up character named Fabiola, who was a Roman pagan noblewoman, and the story is set in Rome in the 4th century, and this is a novel about her conversion to Christianity. This novel includes fictionalized, or not fictionalized, it includes real accounts of Catholic saints that are inserted into the story. But then they are just embellished and kind of, Cardinal Wiseman isn't changing the stories. He's just embellishing them. He's adding things to them because this is a fiction. This is a novel. So it's okay if he kind of adds direct quotes that we have no real historical account for. Cardinal Wiseman is expounding upon the what we do actually have in order to make his novel come to life, I suppose. These are depictions of the way that things might have been, plausible depictions even. And yet the way that I was told, the story that I was told seems pretty influenced by Fabiola, this novel. I mean, we don't know Tarcisius' age, but he's a young boy in Fabiola. Now, of course, that comes from the 6th century text, but it seems like the legend that I grew up with is not the single sentence that was found in a catacomb. The legend that I grew up with is essentially this novel from the 1850s. Sometimes I talk about revisionist history within traditionalism on this channel. Sometimes I talk about how traditionalism claims to be all about the apostolic age and then, the subsequent ages, the first, second, third, and fourth century, the first few centuries after the life of Jesus. But the more you look into it, it really seems like traditionalism is more about like the 19th and the 20th centuries, not the 9th and the 10th century, and definitely not the first and the second and the third and the fourth. And here's the thing. The legend continues to grow. That's what legends do, right? They continue to grow. Let's return to the original video and go to the 1 minute and 32 second mark, because the storyteller says something that's pretty strange.
Catacombs. According to the Holy Father, the Blessed Sacrament was found unharmed, and it had become part of his body.
So Tarcisius, is transported back to the catacombs by that Roman soldier, and he dies along the way. But the priest finds that the Eucharist is unharmed, and that the Eucharist had become part of Tarcisius's body, like it fused to his body. That was not part of the story that I grew up with, and I can't find that anywhere online. I did check the actual Roman martyrology. So St. Tarcisius, you'll notice it is spelt a little bit differently here. You'll find that name spelled differently in different places, but St. Tarcisius's feast day is the 15th of August, and so St. Tarcisius, acolyte. The pagans accosted him as he was carrying the sacrament of Christ's body and began to inquire what it was, but he judged it an unworthy thing to cast pearls before swine. They therefore beat him with sticks and stones until he expired. The sacrilegious searchers examined his body, but found no vestige of the sacrament of Christ, either in his hands or in his clothes. The Christians took up the body of the martyr and buried it reverently in the cemetery of Callistus. That's all that says. So that's interesting. In the story that I told you growing up, the priest confirms that the sacred Eucharist was unharmed. In the Roman martyrology, the Eucharist kind of disappears. The people who kill him search his body and they don't find the Eucharist. And in that YouTube video that I played, it seems like the Eucharist somehow fused to his body. I mean, if you ask me, this is the hallmark of a legend. These are stories that change over time, and I don't know. I guess it's just kind of not shocking. And look at this. This is a children's, like a picture book. It's called The Treasure of St. Tarcisius, Hero of the Eucharist. Now, this book came out only a few months ago, in August of 2024. I have not read this. I will not be purchasing this. But I mean, this... Children's books being written is what causes legends to grow. No, not exactly, but stories being told over and over and over again is what causes legends to grow. And I think that St. Tarcisius' story is exactly that. We start with a single sentence that was found inscribed in a catacomb about some person born in an unknown time, age unknown, who just dies to protect the Eucharist. All that we have is St. Tarcisius died to protect the Eucharist. That's it. From a raving mob. And then all of a sudden, St. Tarcisius becomes a child, which we don't have evidence of his age at all. The raving mob becomes his friends for some reason. We don't have that. And then the Eucharist is miraculously disappearing, or it's fusing to his body, or his body being brought back and the priest confirming. Like, none of that stuff is in the single sentence that we have, and even that single sentence was written 100 years after Tarcisius would have died. So and then look at this. So let's read this description here. St. Tarcisius was a boy who lived in ancient Rome. So do we know that he was a boy, like a young boy? No, we don't. He loved to be outside with his friends, wrestling, running races, and playing games. Do we know that? No, absolutely not. How do we know what he liked? We don't. We have a single sentence about him. This is people making like innocuous assumptions, which, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of Roman boys enjoyed playing games outside. I don't think there was a whole lot else to do when you were a kid back then. But I don't know. I don't think that we can say this, and I think that people don't try to lie, but people like make these embellishments that seem plausible, and these embellishments kind of build on top of one another. Also, something that's interesting is, like, look at this. One day, Pope Sixtus needed someone to take the Eucharist to the Christians in prison. Tarcisius bravely volunteered. Pope Sixtus? That's not part of the original story at all. It was just some priest asks him. And I mean, the one sentence inscription doesn't mention Pope Sixtus at all. So, we went from some person died defending the Eucharist from a raving mob to a child appointed by the Pope himself was going to be, it just, this is how the story grows. And that's how history works, right? Like, that's how legend works. These stories grow over time. And you think that what you're hearing is a story from the 4th century or whatever, but what you're really hearing is a story from the 19th century. And I think that that's like the big, I guess kind of like the big trad lie almost, is that what you think you think that you're partaking in these ancient stories. And no, the story that you're hearing, sure, it has like its origins in something that truly is ancient. But the story that you're hearing, it is really rather quite new. It's a product of, frankly, the 19th century, the 1850s. And I don't know, I just think it's very different. I think that history is very complicated. And I think that trads would do well to remember that history is really complicated and that a lot of their traditions are not nearly as ancient as they think that they are. And that leads me to the final part of today's essay. Let's take the embellished story at face value. A child is sent to bring the Eucharist to some prisoners, and a group of other children beat him to death. Why is this a children's story? Is Lord of the Flies also a children's story? I mean, I think I know the answer to Lord of the Flies being a children's story. So the thing that makes this story great, the story of St. Tarcisius, is not that a child gets beaten to death by other children. Rather, what makes this story great is that a child was so brave and so faithful that he chose to suffer martyrdom rather than to allow the Eucharist to be disrespected. Lord of the Flies, no children are choosing martyrdom, so it's different. But the moral of the story here seems to be martyrdom is a good thing for children to aspire to. That is why we tell the story, to inspire kids to want to be martyrs. I remember being a kid and telling my parents that I really hope I get to be martyred one day. And I would justify it saying, like, not only is this like the most surefire way of getting to heaven, but it's a direct flight. There's no layovers in purgatory. And I remember being really scared about purgatory because I was being told that, the pain in purgatory is just as bad or worse than the pain in hell. And the only thing that's like, keeping you sane, I guess, is like the knowledge that it will end one day. And then I remember being really confused when my mom would say something like, well, Kevin, like, let's hope it never comes to that. And I legitimately was like, no, Mom, I really hope it does come to that. And I know why my mom said that. If push came to shove and I was in a position where I could either allow the Eucharist to fall into the hands of some pagans who would undoubtedly spit on it and throw it on the ground and stuff like that, or I could die. And if my mom was like on the sidelines yelling at me, telling me what to do, she would not ask me to die. She would say, Kevin, hand over the Eucharist, hand over your wallet, hand over whatever they ask for, and walk away. Because my mom didn't want me to die, not even as a martyr. If you're a parent, let me ask you, would you want your kid to die like St. Tarcisius if your kid was in the position that St. Tarcisius was in? I think that the correct answer here is yes. You would want your children to die if they were in a situation like that. But if you do respond yes, I don't know. I'm not sure I believe you. Maybe I should believe you, though. There are mothers, in certain parts of the world right now who, brag about their sons being killed in holy wars and things like that. So maybe I should believe you when you say that you would rather have your kid die than have your kid give up the Eucharist. I guess all of that to say is I think I kind of understand the culture that produces terrorists, because I wanted to die for my faith when I was younger. Anyway, I'm kind of shocked that my martyrdom complex didn't have lasting effects on me. I don't think it did anyway. I mean, I do like a good self-sacrificial character arc in a story, but I think that's the worst impact that my martyrdom complex had on me, long term. But I could see this kind of thing really impacting somebody, really screwing somebody up. I think it's really, really wild for a kid to want to be a martyr. I guess I got lucky that I turned out mostly okay. Mostly, anyway. I think. I'll let you be the judge of that. Thanks, everybody.